At this point, it's pretty well known that I play a lot of survival crafters. The building, the crafting, the surviving, what's not to love? So it's no surprise that Enshrouded was an easy pickup for me and well on my radar, besides playing its demo in October during Steam's Next Fest. Enshrouded hit a weird time though, and I made a bet. It's yet to be seen if I made the right choice, but we can talk all about the legally distinct Battle Monster game when I get around to playing it. It's a busy start to the year after all. Enshrouded has been much hyped since being announced, and in such a tight race for the top slots in the forefront of minds, it's very difficult to hold that top slot for long. With the rise of games like Valheim, V Rising, Palworld, Raft, Ark, The Forest, Satisfactory, Void Train, and many, many more, that race is only going to get tighter. Much like all of my clothes if I keep sitting around and playing these games instead of touching grass. Who needs real grass though, when there's so many plants to pick and ores to find in these big open worlds? And I've only named the ones that are playable right now. Nightingale is coming in hot on the heels of Enshrouded, and the hype is pretty big in that camp too. The wait is finally over to jump in this new open world, and now that it's out in early access, can the differences in exploring, building, and world development bring Enshrouded to the big leagues? Or will this game have a career in the minor leagues at best? Grab your pickaxe and weapon of choice as we delve into the misty depths of Enshrouded's loop. The gameplay of Enshrouded, unfortunately, is pretty bog standard. That's not to throw any sort of shade or shroud, I guess, at this new title or Keen Studios, but it may actually be a win for the game in the long run. Keeping with some pretty common themes and gameplay mechanics to its contemporaries is probably good for a fledgling game like Enshrouded. Where things go wildly different are the nods to other top games in tangential genres. There are a handful of almost ripped off, and in some cases completely ripped off, mechanics to be found that actually fit like they were built from the ground up in Enshrouded. Namely, the game takes a huge dose of inspiration from the Legend of Zelda franchise, specifically Breath of the Wild, and I guess by proxy, Tears of the Kingdom. The stamina gauges are a one-for-one rip from those titles, and honestly, it just makes the game easier to read. It gives a great reference point for players, and doesn't take your eyes away from the task at hand while you're climbing, mining, or next major rip, gliding across the map. Yes, the Zelda-style gliding has made its way into the survival crafter genre as well, right down to the towers littered across the map to give you some height and a way to get around the massive map quickly. The bag system is fairly similar to those games as well, but inventory management in general in these games is hard to mess up. That wheel does not need to be reinvented, but a little refinement could go a long way. The combat in Enshrouded feels like a nod to many other games as well. Valheim is similar, Breath of the Wild is similar, hell, even Remnant, Dark Souls, and Elden Ring can be used as comparisons here. Swing your sword, charge your magic, draw your bow, it's pretty straightforward. The one oddball in my opinion is the wand weapons. For most of the game I avoided magic altogether. I tend to lean heavily into sword and board tanks, but we started to pick up a lot of spells along the way and they would have just sat there if someone didn't use them. So I started speccing into Battle Mage on the massive talent tree, which just so happens to border into tank, and mess around with some magic. The wands themselves are probably my favorite weapon in the game. It felt really good to have a shield and wand combo, blocking attacks and arrows from enemies while firing away with my main hand. I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, but I felt like a more active tank while using a wand than a sword. I could get a little distance, block what felt like a great number of attacks, and still dole out damage to all the enemies that run up to our group throughout the map. Archery felt good as well, but trying to balance all the weapons I wanted to use with the talents and systems in the games made things a bit difficult for me at times. I ended up defaulting to magic near the end of the early access content and giving all the good bows and arrows to my party's default archer. The enemies that littered the world all feel mostly different with a couple of small caveats. The animals and man-eating plants all feel unique and have different mechanics, like wolves attacking mostly in packs, the spitter plants using range against you, and man-eating mushrooms that spray poison in your face at any given time. There are tons of different beasts to deal with, and each gets stronger as the game goes on. The humanoid enemies are where shit gets real. Let's start with the scavengers, groups of deformed beings that have taken over much of the land in the game's world, looking to get what they can from the old world and use it to their advantage, and for their survival. They too are fighting against the Shroud and doing their best to survive. Unfortunately for them, they just happen to get in our way. Many of the scavenger enemies fight similarly, with two single-handed weapons or large crossbow type weapons that fire out multiple projectiles, and also grenades. Fun times if you get caught on the bad side of those volleys. The next group is the Vuka, a race of owlbears or bugbears, or for all you WoW players out there, boom chickens, that have a very tribal and naturalistic way of life. except for their love of combat and bloodsport. They have a few variations, with the main two being sword wielding and a druidic caster that can deal magic damage and also heal. The last major group, and probably the most common enemies in the whole game, are the Shroud enemies. Seemingly former humans and residents of this area, they were hit by the blight of the Shroud and forever changed. But the Shroud has more secrets than old soldiers and civilians. Many enemies in the Shroud are variants of enemies from other groups, notably the flora and the fauna. They also add in flying beetle bugs that swarm and can deal some pretty large damage if you're not paying attention. There's also a group of magical undead that I can't quite tell where they belong. They may be Shroud related, there may be darker things at play here. Only time and additional game content may give us that answer. Last but certainly not least are the bosses that you fight along your journey, and in some cases, multiple times along the way. These range from large brutes from the Shroud, horrid monstrosities, beasts tainted by the corruption, Vuka that have become hulks in their quest for strength, and casters of dark magics. Some of these fights are fairly easy and require just the standard fighting mechanics. Others, like the dragon in the capital and the casters, take a bit more thought and movement to deal with. All in, the bosses here are a lot of fun, though I think the matrons may still be overtuned even after the first major game patch. Enshrouded's game world feels really fleshed out and fantastic. It may be one of the best we've seen to date in this genre. Sure, V Rising has its perfect tones and design for all its zones, and Valheim is distinct while giving players and servers room to move and grow, but Enshrouded feels cohesive while still having sweeping variation. There is still time to mess this up or break it up a little bit, like Valheim with Mistlands changes, but so far everything feels like it's mostly distinct and has variation throughout the runtime of the early access content. There are 4 major zones that the players pass through in this state of the game: the Springlands, the Revelwood, Nomad Highlands, and the Kindle Wastes. Each of these zones has their own variations of enemies, terrain, and general vibe. They also add levels to the Shroud's enemies and variation. Starting in the Springlands, a very open meadow-like landscape that gives the ultimate feel of generic starting zone without feeling all that generic. The exploration of this zone takes up probably the most time in the game from the start and is the only zone with 2 towers to climb. It's where many people will build their first base and where ours was for the entirety of the playthrough. The Revelwood was the second zone, and it layers in some details that feel like a good progression from the Springlands, with some new enemies, new materials to find, and some enhancements to the overall aesthetic. It's also the zone that I had the most trouble rendering for some reason. Many times I would be walking around the zone and it would look like the whole thing was made out of Play-Doh. That seems to have been mostly fixed with some of the patches that came out later in my playtime, but it was funny at least and not completely game-breaking. Nomad Highlands is a third zone, and I actually got here by accident, or by force, depending on how you look at it. There is a gate that bars your progression into the zone, but a careful hand and quick jump key will get you into the zone and allow some exploration, and maybe even some loot. The area reminded me a lot of the Barrens from World of Warcraft. Minus the Barrens chat, unless you count the mean things my party says back and forth at each other in Discord. Its dry grass, tumbleweed, and fossil aesthetic was a great change after spending most of our time in the very lush zones previous. Though that gate is there for a reason, the jump in gearing and levels can be felt here more than anywhere else in this point of the game. Maybe don't let yourself run too wild with skyrimming up mountainsides. The last playable zone in the early access portion of the game is the Kindle Wastes, a desert covered in sand and magic. There were many spots in the Kindle Wastes where new, more difficult magic enemies were brought into play, and with that, my biggest change in gameplay style. I had joked that I was going to be a healer and a tank at the same time, and for the most part that didn't really happen. Until the Kindle Wastes, where magic and range damage in general felt like it was doing the vast majority of the work for our party. The desert hides many secrets and temples, all kind of playing into the magic desert area. Overall, the zone seems to be the most barren. Not sure if that's by design or because it's the end of the current game loop in early access. The thing that you'll be dealing with in all of these zones is the Shroud, and the difficulty ramp in the Shroud as the game progresses is pretty steep. It is a very interesting mechanic that helps to differentiate this game from its contemporaries. The Shroud is plopped about the map, an organic mushroom-grown zombie-fueled nightmare that of course has the power to corrupt and take those that wander a little too far or are exposed for a little too long into its grasp, corrupting everyone and everything around. That includes the man-eating plants, the screeching flying monsters, and every single soldier that followed orders a little too closely. The scariest part of the Shroud is everything that used to be water is now a red mass that kills you more or less instantly. The red, as we came to call it, can hit you very suddenly and very sporadically. Sometimes it's a whole river of the stuff that needs to be crossed and isn't very forgiving. Other times you'll find a pit by accident while running through the Shroud at full speed, attempting to avoid the enemies that follow you. The last bit on the common parts of the Shroud is the timer. As the game goes on, you can grow the timer to spend a little bit more time in the Shroud, but early on, you get a brief few minutes to handle whatever it is you plan to do in the miasma. There is one additional layer to the shroud, and that's the pink shroud, or deadly shroud as the game so kindly references it. It's meant to be the gating mechanic to higher level zones. Much like the red, your time ticks down pretty quickly in this area, and you will die fairly quickly as well, so be careful, but there are some ways to push that shroud back. Leveling up the flame altar is the key to the shroud mechanic in a lot of ways, from adding additional time to unlocking deeper parts of the shroud. The altar and the flame are your tools to fight back here. There are some additional things to find throughout the world that help to drive the game along, like dungeons, camps, elixir wells, and towers. Starting with dungeons, they seem to just be like little puzzle troves that have some sort of loot at the end. Usually by the time we find most of them, the loot wasn't very good, but the break in the main story to do some extra exploring was a fun addition. Camps of enemies or towns of them in some cases felt like good spots to grind levels or practice, and were always interesting to stumble upon. You may find additional lore, quests, or even items hanging around, but the fight once again wasn't always worth the reward. Elixir wells and shroud roots dot the map and work for two purposes based on our playthrough. One, as a good addition to leveling and gaining skill points, and two, as a capstone of sorts to the different areas of each biome. You generally have a capstone dungeon or quest that you hit outside of the regular shroud in each zone, but the wells give a good chance on top of that in many cases makes you prove your combat prowess and team play dynamics. Last but not least are the towers in each zone, a fast travel and height system to allow for the gliding mechanic to feel good. Very similar once again to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. These towers were puzzles full of loot and materials, and at the top, you get a fast travel point to help your exploration throughout the rest of the zone. These additional little points add some flavor to a vast map and help to guide your overall path through each zone, leading into the future zones and the story overall. I think that we're all pretty aware that there's two major parts to any game in this genre, survival and crafting, but I'm going to make a counter argument here. Crafting and building are not the same thing. There are some that lump these together and consider them all part of the experience, but really much of Enshrouded's hype was around its building system. The story, the world, the gameplay, and yes, even the crafting, all came second for many players riding on the hype train. We're going to talk about both here, but let's talk about the differences first, because opinions matter, and mine are always correct opinions. Building in a survival crafter is paramount to the genre, but it's not in the generalized game. Generally, crafting is part of the building system overall, going as far as creating the needed materials, but it's not usually that you go into a menu and get a prefab base. Your creativity matters, and the sky is the limit here. There, that's my pitch. Take what you want from that, tell your friends. Builder crafter genre title superiority. Now, on to Enshrouded's building. The voxels are sick. It's a great build system. You can do some really cool stuff with it. When the shit lines up and doesn't drive me up a wall for 45 minutes, specifically with roof tiles. God, the roof tiles when they don't line up. But when they do, it's some of the coolest roofing you can have in a game. I can't believe I just talked about roofing in a fantasy video game like that, but goddamn, this system feels great when it's on point. I have some additional points on building, but let's talk about the crafting system. It's a little bog standard, to be honest. The upgrade system and the work towards the top for each craftsperson is done through a questing system to go find a key component. That key component is something they need to craft a new table and level up. Sometimes those new tables are just the item, and that's great. Other times you get the new item, and then you need to build a table, and it unlocks 2 more, and then you have to build that in order to get the next gear that you need. Overall, the system is fine, and I attribute most of the issues with it to being early access, and not seeing the overall picture of how these tables might work together. What really bothered me at this point is the fact that many of these peripherals and tools only had one recipe associated with them, and things that would make sense with those tools need something completely different to craft. It's early. I'm not throwing the system under the bus yet, but there's still some work to be done. One other thing that bugged me about the overall crafting system is the need for more duplicate tables, and in many cases, you had to get way further down the line to make a duplicate, not as soon as you unlock the base one from a quest. I guess to some degree it makes sense. You just got this item to help and couldn't make it before. Why would you be able to do it now? But with the smelter and the other items like it that you needed to wait, or in some cases because early access, you couldn't make another one at all, it really didn't feel all that great. The progression for the crafting and building system seems to be tied to a couple different things, one of them being your level. It felt kind of arbitrary at times that your level would be used for this. After all, if you're finding materials and plowing through the story, what does your level matter? New quests seemed to pop up at the craftsman right after we would gain a level, and they would send us off to places to find new materials or new items for them to use. The other tie to the system is the flame altar. As you scale up your level and defeat bigger and badder monsters, you gain new flame levels in 2 categories. One that gives you an actual benefit to your player character, and the other that allows you to build a bigger base. Building a bigger base was actually the more interesting of these choices for me. It's a cube-shaped build limit that grows, meaning vertical as well. Dig a basement, a secret exit, a secure vault, build a watchtower, a tiered garden, whatever you want. But most importantly, the coolest thing we did in our playthrough is build a village. With all the craftspeople and all the necessities they have, building them their own private areas was a driving force for my group, and while 2 of us were away with busy schedules, it gave our 3rd player the opportunity to build a nice little village for the restart of humanity that the game intends. It's really cool to use all of the available space that the upgraded altar gives you to add more than just a bigger house. At one point, one of our players built a hedge maze and a secret bunker at the end, until it started to crash his game every time he went back home. The maze had to come down, but the option to build one is really fantastic and shows just how crazy some of these builds can get. The story in Enshrouded is one thing for sure: incomplete. There are a lot of lore bits to find throughout the game, and the intro cinematic gives a good amount of backstory before starting the game. But I'm not going to go through all the story up through the end like I would normally do. Why? Because the story isn't over, and there is still time to change, retcon, or develop more to go alongside what we already know. There could be more craftspeople added that have different information and perspectives than we have seen before. There could be complete and total changes to the story, and characters in it that we have come to know through documents and quest info. Assumptions we can make about characters being alive or dead right now could be completely broken very quickly into the next section of the game, so we can talk briefly on the basics and move on from there. The player takes on the role of a Flameborn, a humanoid but not quite human cryo-sleep time traveler. That's a lot of broad words, but the true nature of the Flameborn hasn't really been given to us yet. Your goal is to restart the world and fight back against Shroud at a later date, after the fall of humanity, and all the other bad shit that has taken place in Embervale over that time. The Shroud and all of the other aforementioned bad shit started when a mysterious traveler brought a bottle of elixir to humanity. Labeled as a panacea that could cure any illness and make humanity stronger, it very quickly turned into a drug at best and a curse at worst for humans. They began to make wells to find the key ingredient deep below ground and refine it into the elixir for their own benefit and production, in turn unleashing the Shroud and all the nasty that comes with it, turning men into monsters and corrupting everything it touches. In a last-ditch effort, humanity partnered with the ancients to create the Flameborn and set them up to fix what humanity broke in their time. Then we wake up in a flame vault and begin to piece together what happened while we were asleep and fight back against the Shroud and all the other nasties that took root while we napped. Kingdoms fell, civil wars were fought, new enemies sprouted, and dark magics were unearthed while we were out. So now it's time to take back our lands and rebuild. One of my favorite things to talk about with games of this nature are its differences between games of the same genre and other contemporaries. We touched on a couple things earlier in this review, but I really want to take a look at the building, exploration, and future of this title. Many people thought that building in Valheim was possibly the best it could be. It felt real. You needed support, and the variety of what could be done was massive. That said, Enshrouded may give it a run for all it's worth. It takes a bit of getting used to, but the range of what is possible in Enshrouded is staggering. Dig out entire basements quickly and easily, make entire villages, the hedge maze, multi-family dwellings, smiths, workshops, and so much more. It all starts with the material types you can make. As you go about your life in Enshrouded, many more materials become available that can be turned into blocks. These blocks are the foundations of what you can build and how it will look. No more raw materials into a wall or floor. You can quickly and easily make a stack of building materials and get to the build process. Build whatever you dream of. It really is a cool concept, but I think Valheim has it beat in one key aspect. The decorative angles of some of its building materials and angles lead to some more fluid designs compared to Enshrouded. There are more slopes and curves in Valheim than Enshrouded, and it makes things a bit more fun to play with at times. The snapping of certain materials in both games could use some work. Roofing in particular does not like to play nice all the time, but overall, once I got the hang of the building system, my mind was running on all cylinders. The exploration of the world feels like a good next spot to talk about, and there are many other games that Enshrouded compares to in this field. From the Breath of the Wild style gliding and stamina mechanics, to the vast world overall that you can explore and the different biomes that come into play. This game has a lot to offer, even in its first early access stage. The diversity of how the biomes look is great. How they play and how some of the areas are built though could use some work. Even in some of the bigger zones with more verticality, much of the area feels very flat until it's not, and then it's completely unscalable terrain that you have to walk all the way back around the area in a different direction to get to. For how explorable and open this game feels, there are a lot of railroaded experiences that take some of that fun away. Comparing the game to Valheim and Breath of the Wild feels like the easy choice here, but I really think that I want to compare it to V Rising. I know that's a wild choice, but hear me out. There's like 1 or 2 ways to enter most zones. There's small camps or towns to clear out for materials, enemies roam over the roads to get in your way quite often, and if you pick the wrong fight at the wrong time, you're as good as dead. It also feels very flat, but that's part of the charm, where here, I'm not sure how big the map is matters as much when following the roads is a better choice in most aspects. And the scenic route is like traveling through the Midwest in a car. Flat, lots of grass fields, and occasionally you'll see a crazy person on the side of the road looking to pick a fight. But all of the above can be slightly set aside for one key factor in Enshrouded. This is early access. And according to the developer, this is only 1/3 of the game overall that we are seeing. This isn't the end. Not all of the building pieces are in the game. The maps overall can be reworked, and for the zones we got in the first 50 hours or so, the differences are really good. We will see what the rest of early access looks like for this game, and hopefully one day, what the full release entails. Until that time, it's hard to judge a game like this early on. But it was a good time, and the hope for the future is there. The bones are strong. I just wish there was more meat on them, and that wish seems to be the same wish the developers share. Alright, so there's one final section to talk about with Enshrouded, and of course, that's the issues. Again, there's only so much that anyone should complain about with an early access game, as much of the overall gameplay may be there, but the fixes, patches, and extra tweaks are all still to come. The same cannot be said for server issues from third parties. At the start of the whole process, there were very few servers available. My best guess, with no information, is that many servers were sold for Palworld as its height hit right about the time of launch. About 3 days or so before Enshrouded launched to be exact. And it felt like all the server providers didn't have stock to sell for Enshrouded. The servers that were available were laughable at best. Connection issues, lag, unplayable honestly, with little to no help from the providers. I run a dedicated server for other games, so I figured I could give it a shot, and running it for my own server was a night and day change, not only for me, but for the other players in my party. Not quite sure what the issues were there, maybe underpowered machines or core RAM limits, but it was a hot mess those first few days. Back inside the game, there were bugs all over, from not being able to leave the starting room, to quests not working correctly, not syncing across party, and more. I think I understand why the cross-party thing didn't work. The game is meant to be played by multiple people at the same time, all handling quests on their own. But some things work cross-party and some don't, so maybe I'm just lost. The shrines out in the world also didn't seem to work cross-party, even if we were all at the same shrine all at the same time. It was more than a little frustrating to not have a check mark on them, the same way you do for elixir wells and shroud routes. But that could be an easy fix realistically. Only one member of our party was going for a full completion on achievements, and he was able to do so after a server reset and finding a third-party map online. The game feels like a running simulator a lot of the time, and with how vast the map can be, it has some major lulls in the action. I would really like to see some kind of speed increase or mount available to cross a lot of this open land. Besides just trying to glide and cheese half the zone mechanics overall, it was a lot of open land. My last major issue with this iteration of the game is that there was no real ending to what was here. I'm not sure if the pacing was off just because there's more to come, but the battle at Pikesmead felt like way more of a close to a section of the game than anything in the Kindle Waste did, as the last zone. I would have liked to see at least a final boss section there that felt a bit more like the ending of a chapter, rather than leaving midway through and having nothing else to do. Again though, with all of these issues, I'm hopeful for what comes next. There is a great game here. It's a little rough and needs some polish and better server providers, but once the game gets going, there's much to explore and conquer in Embervale. Now that the game has its hooks in me and the rest of my party, we eagerly await what comes next for Enshrouded. With just how much of the game is left to come though, I have a feeling this game may end up in early access hell. There are a lot of promises, and we have seen this type of thing from games before. I really want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but many of us, as fans of this genre, have been burned many times before. I hope that the developers really move to make this a great showing and an easy top 5 choice in the survival crafts genre. But there is a lot to contend with regarding its contemporaries. I'm not sure how much the Palworld launch changed or affected the launch of this game, but I hope that it has more room to grow and develop. Most of all, I really just want to continue the story and have a better understanding of the scope and purpose. There are many opportunities for this game, and even more opportunities for the genre as a whole, with new players dropping in all the time. Who will be the top dog of the genre? We don't know yet, but Enshrouded has a chance to glide into that top slot.